Well, good afternoon. Good afternoon to you, and thanks for coming out on a warm Sunday. Welcome to Charleston, West Virginia's historic McFarland Hubbard House, headquarters of the West Virginia Humanities Council, the official state affiliate of the National Endowment for the Humanities. As always, please allow me a moment to thank the West Virginia Humanities Council staff, all of whom pulled together to make events like today happen, but particularly to Kyle Wormack, program officer, who has curated this series since his arrival here in 2020. In this, our 50th anniversary year, the Council's Little Lecture Series is funded in part by United We Stand, a special initiative of the National Endowment for the Humanities in support of programs that encourage civic engagement, social cohesion, and cross-cultural understanding. And in such a context, I can think of few topics more relevant than the focus of today's talk. It's very hard to enter into a discussion of the Gaza crisis without citing moral judgments. One may say that an attack such as the one perpetrated on Israeli citizens in October of last year should never have happened, and in the same breath and with the same conviction, that the killing and starvation of Palestinian civilians occurring right now should not be happening. The annual threat assessment of the U.S. intelligence community, released by the Office of the Director of National Intelligence in February of this year, begins by noting how inextricably interrelated regional and global conditions are in the present world. Quote, "During the next year, the United States faces an increasingly fragile global order, strained by accelerating strategic competition among major powers, more intense and unpredictable transnational challenges, and multiple regional conflicts with far-reaching implications. One need only look at the Gaza crisis to see how a regional crisis can have widespread spillover effects and complicate international cooperation on other pressing issues." End quote. The conflicts that beset our world are neither quickly nor easily comprehended. Serious consideration of them requires clear, informed thought and a willingness to discuss our thoughts calmly and civilly. The rhetoric of crisis often moves us to see these as luxuries we do not have, yet we know that the less willing we are to commit ourselves to them, the surer it is that chaos and disorder will persist. Feeling powerless so far away from this unfolding historical moment, it's easy to store up outrage and indignation. But that's not what today is about. As we do at each little lecture, we enter this room, all of us, knowing that we all bring our own perspectives and insights, our own contributory knowledge that illustrates precisely why civil public dialogue is essential to public health. I dare say there have not been many little lecturers in the history of this series who have witnessed the far-reaching implications of regional conflict much more intimately than today's speaker. Dr. Peter Mansoor is today the General Raymond E. Mason Jr. Chair in Military History at The Ohio State University. But over a distinguished career in the U.S. Army, Colonel Mansoor served in a variety of command and staff positions in the United States, Europe, and the Middle East. He commanded the 1st Brigade, 1st Armored Division from 2003 to 2005, including 13 months in combat in Iraq, and concluded his service in 2008 as executive officer to General David Petraeus during the surge period in Iraq. Dr. Mansoor brings to today's talk the perspective of a trained historian who also had to make life and death decisions for several thousand military personnel among a population of civilians, some of whom were insurgents seeking to harm the American and Iraqi lives for which he was responsible. He's been in the chair, so to speak, when lives were in the balance, and the outcomes of his decision also had to reflect the policies of the United States military and the stated aims of a U.S. presidential administration. Drawing from his own experiences in Iraq and the Pentagon, his talk today is meant to enlighten us in this intimate and collegial setting and in the spirit of thoughtful analysis about what situations like this can look like on the ground. Please make welcome Dr. Peter Mansoor.
Well, thanks, Eric, for that excellent introduction. And thanks, Kyle, for the invitation to speak today, and welcome everyone. So my goal here today is to talk about the war in Gaza through the lens of our wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. So we'll talk a lot about what happened in those two conflicts and then compare them to what's happening in Gaza today. Hopefully we'll all learn a lot, as I did preparing this lecture. So let's begin with the rise of Hamas. It's a Palestinian Islamist political military group established in 1987 during the first Palestinian Intifada, or uprising against Israel. It became a rival to the Palestinian Liberation Organization and its successor, the Palestinian Authority, which currently governs on the West Bank. It came to power in the Gaza Strip in January 2006 through democratic means. There were actually elections held, and it defeated the rival Fatah party. But subsequent rival clashes led to Fatah vacating Gaza. So Hamas ended up governing Gaza, and Fatah ended up governing the West Bank. And oh, by the way, in the sort of one man, one vote, one time ideal, they never repeated the elections after 2006 in either place. So right now, Hamas governs what's left of Gaza at any rate, and the Palestinian Authority governs the West Bank. And we need to keep this in mind because there's a lot of discussion about reintroducing the Palestinian Authority to Gaza, where it once governed. The goal of Hamas, though, is the creation of an independent Palestinian state. Good enough, except that their version of the Palestinian state goes from the river to the sea, as you've probably heard these chants lately. Well, that would be the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea, and that's land now occupied by the state of Israel. So creating a Palestinian state in that area would require the dissolution of the state of Israel. And this is the core of the conflict, right? You have two peoples, both of who want the same piece of land. Hamas is armed, trained, and funded by Iran. And we all know what happened recently with Iran getting into the conflict, launching ballistic and cruise missiles and drones at Israel, and then the response by Israel. There's another group here, Palestinian Islamic Jihad. It is another Sunni Islamist group seeking to establish an Islamist Palestinian state. It's also committed to the destruction of Israel, and it's the second largest militant group in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. It also receives support from Iran as well as Syria and Lebanese Hezbollah. And the military wing of the Palestinian Islamic Jihad sometimes operates in coordination with Hamas, but they are rivals. And so they have a tense relationship. All right, so that's the Palestinian side. Now let's talk about the Israelis. So after the end of the Second Intifada, the uprising between 2000 and 2005, on the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, Israel voluntarily withdrew from Gaza. It had settlements there occupied by Jewish settlers. They were forcibly removed, and Israel vacated Gaza and then sealed its border with Gaza. Well, soon thereafter, of course, Hamas rose to power in the Gaza Strip with its stated intention of destroying Israel. So Israel essentially blockaded Gaza. It can do this because its land border, most of Gaza's land border is with Israel. Its sea border, the Mediterranean Sea, is controlled by Israel and only has a very small portion of its land border that abuts Egypt. So this led to essentially what became one of the world's largest open-air prisons, as Israel controlled what could go in and out of Gaza. Hamas is engaged in continual conflict with Israel ever since it came to power, primarily in the form of rocket attacks against both military and civilian targets in Israel, but also occasional cross-border incursions. Hamas built an extensive tunnel network. It's been in the news, of course, and some of these tunnels actually were under the border with Israel, so they would tunnel underneath the border, come up in Israel, and then conduct terrorist activities. It's also led Israel to having an extensive engineering effort to discover these tunnels, something that also occurred during World War I on the Western Front. So this is not new in military history. Israel's response to this is euphemistically termed mowing the grass, right? The grass grows up, terrorism grows up, you cut it, you conduct a military operation to defeat it, and then it's good for a while, but then the grass grows up again, right? So Israel conducted periodic incursions, artillery fire, and airstrikes into Gaza to reestablish deterrence for a time. And then, of course, the arsenal of Hamas would grow up again, and they would conduct more attacks. This led to Israeli invasions in 2008, 2009. That was Operation Cast Lead. 2012, which was Operation Pillars of Defense, and 2014, which was Operation Protective Edge. In response, Israel created a very extensive anti-ballistic and anti-drone system called the Iron Dome system. It was created between 2007 and 2011. It's a very innovative system of air defenses, the first of its kind in the world, and very effective. So basically, the radars will track incoming rockets. If they are headed for pasture land or open desert, they just let them go. But if they're headed for urban areas, they'll send up interceptors to target and destroy them. Since he came to power for the second time in 2009, the government of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu surprisingly gave tacit support to Hamas to weaken Mahmoud Abbas, the president of the Palestinian Authority. So Netanyahu's primary goal is to prevent the creation of a Palestinian state. And he believed that by supporting Hamas against its rival, the Palestinian Authority, he could achieve this goal. Netanyahu allowed cash transfusions from abroad, issued work permits to Gazans, and from 2014 to 2023, did not react sharply to rocket attacks from Gaza. There were no Israeli ground incursions during those 9 years. And like I said, the purpose was to weaken the Palestinian Authority, prevent the creation of a Palestinian state. And he thought that this strategy could be pursued ad infinitum. And the relative calm was an illusion, as Hamas was obviously preparing to attack. So this is the Israeli blockade of Gaza. You can see that the land border, most of it is with Israel, small land border with Egypt, and then the Israeli Navy controls the Mediterranean. And these are the rocket attacks from Gaza into Israel. Peak in 2014, which was also the last ground incursion of Israel into Gaza prior to this year, 2023, and then some since. And those rockets are still being fired, not very many, because Israel controls most of Gaza now, but they have not stopped. So on October 7th, 2023, Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad launched a surprise attack on Israel. It was a massive intelligence failure by Israeli military intelligence along the lines of their failure to predict the 1973 Yom Kippur War, 50 years earlier. The attack began with a barrage of 5,000 rockets. Now, in comparison, you could see here that in one day it equaled the total number of rockets fired in 2014, which was the year in which the most rockets were fired by Hamas against Israel. So they had stored them up for a single barrage. This was in just 20 minutes, and it was meant to overwhelm the Iron Dome system. That was followed by around 3,000 militants who breached the barrier with Israel. They went through tunnels, they used bulldozers to go through the barrier, they also paraglided over it. And then they attacked the military bases and civilian communities on the other side, and then obviously in one very famous case, a music festival. The attackers killed around 1,200 military and police personnel and civilians, while about 240 were taken as hostages back to Gaza. In the wake of the attack, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu vowed to destroy Hamas. "We are fighting a cruel enemy," he said, "worse than ISIS." And he compared the attack by Hamas with that of the Islamic State, which was destroyed by U.S., Iraqi, and Kurdish forces in 2017. Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant went further, stating, "We will wipe this thing called Hamas, ISIS, Gaza off the face of the earth. It will cease to exist." And we need to remember these goals here. So you have the Prime Minister and his Minister of Defense both saying the same thing. The goal is to destroy Hamas. Now, in military terminology, that means a very specific thing. You have to go in, kill all the fighters, kill the leadership, reduce the infrastructure. It's a very extensive military mission, very hard to complete. Israeli ambassador to the UN, Gilad Erdan, compared the attack to the toppling of the World Trade Center and the attack on the Pentagon in 2001, declaring, "This is Israel's 9/11." That's an interesting comparison, for in the wake of the terror attacks by al-Qaeda on the United States, President George W. Bush made almost a similarly expansive pledge, declaring, "Our war on terror begins with al-Qaeda, but it does not end there. It will not end until every terrorist group of global reach has been found, stopped, and defeated." Now, he didn't use the word destroy, but I would ask you today, are there terrorist groups with global reach that have not been defeated? Yes. So we were unable to accomplish that goal, although we did devastate al-Qaeda and kill 2 of its leaders. The wars of 9/11, though, began with an American invasion of Afghanistan in league with the Afghan United Front, the so-called Northern Alliance. The immediate goals were to force the Taliban from power and to destroy al-Qaeda. We had given the Taliban a warning. They could either give up bin Laden and his associates, or they would be attacked. They refused to give them up, so we attacked. But very little thought or resources were put into what would happen once these goals were attained. In September 2001, this is right about the time that the first special forces and CIA agents went into Afghanistan, President Bush asked his war cabinet, "So who's going to run the country?" Meaning Afghanistan. And he was met with a lot of blank stares. And that is the cardinal sin here. So what went wrong? The invasion succeeded militarily. It toppled the Taliban from power by the end of the year, but the war didn't end. An interim administration headed by Hamid Karzai took power as an Afghan Loya Jirga fashioned a new constitution for the country. Non-governmental and international relief organizations began to deliver humanitarian aid and reconstruction support, but their efforts were uncoordinated. U.S. trainers began creating a new Afghan national army, but lack of funding, insufficient volunteers, and inadequate facilities hampered this effort. And think about who's going to secure Gaza when the fighting ends. And you can see the problem here. The period between 2002 and 2006 was the best opportunity to create a resilient Afghan state with enough security forces to hold its own against a resurgent Taliban. But due to a lack of focus, inadequate resources, and poor strategy, along with the diversion of most military resources to the war in Iraq, the United States and its allies squandered the opportunity. As a result, the Taliban were able to reconstitute their forces in Pakistan, in the border regions, and return to the fight. As the insurgency gained momentum, the United States and its NATO allies increased their troop levels, but they could not overcome the weakness of the Kabul government and the lack of adequate numbers of trained Afghan security forces. Despite a surge of forces to Afghanistan during the first 2 years of the Obama administration and the killing of Osama bin Laden, the Taliban remain undefeated. As Western forces departed the country around 2014, Afghan forces took the lead in security operations, but their numbers and competence proved insufficient in the end to stem the Taliban tide. Negotiations went nowhere as the Taliban realized they could seize by force what they could not gain at the bargaining table. The Taliban entry into Kabul in August 2001 merely put an exclamation point on a campaign that was lost many years before. Okay, so let's shift to Iraq. The expectation of the Bush administration was that Iraq would be a war of liberation, that the Iraqis would, by and large, welcome U.S. forces because they were toppling a brutal and hated dictator. Well, no one told the Sunnis, because they were the part of Iraqi society that benefited from Saddam's governance and his largesse. And so there was going to be about 20% of the Iraqi people who were going to oppose this invasion, and we failed to see that. It quickly became apparent that in toppling Saddam Hussein from power and dismantling the ruthless apparatus of government that had kept the Ba'ath Party in power for more than 3 decades, the United States and its allies had unleashed forces that at the time were not well understood. The fundamental error, the Bush administration was fighting the war they wanted to fight rather than understanding the war they had unleashed. Every good military historian has to have at least one Karl von Clausewitz quote in his talk. He's a famous 19th century Prussian military philosopher who wrote a seminal book called On War. But he stated this, that the first, the supreme, the most far-reaching act of judgment that the statesman and commander have to make is to establish the kind of war on which they are embarking, neither mistaking it for nor trying to turn it into something that is alien to its nature. So was this a war of liberation, or was it something else? And this assumption should have been re-examined once U.S. forces got to Baghdad and toppled Saddam Hussein. In fact, George W. Bush, in his memoir Decision Points, admits that we should have examined these decisions to de-Ba'athify Iraq, to disband the Iraqi army. We may have come to the same conclusion and done it anyway, but at least we would have understood the second and third order effects of what we were doing. Instead, we were simply taking actions without a lot of thought put into it. Strategic errors compounded by the lack of planning for the war's aftermath. So there was a lot of effort put into making sure there wasn't a humanitarian crisis in Iraq. Unlike Gaza, where the Israelis put almost no thought into the humanitarian situation. So good on the United States, we were at least thinking about that, but we were not thinking about the possibility of a segment of the Iraqi people rising up in an insurgency. Ambassador Paul Bremer went in May 2003 and headed up the Coalition Provisional Authority, the governing authority for Iraq in that first year. And his decisions contributed to the strategic errors and sowed the seeds of the insurgency. First, he de-Ba'athified Iraqi government. So the Ba'ath Party is a hierarchical organization, has about 6 levels, and he lopped off the top 3 levels and said these levels can't participate in the civic life of Iraq anymore. You can't vote, you can't run for office. The first 2 levels would have been all right. That would have been about 1,000 individuals, the head Sunnis and so forth. But by going down to the 3rd level, he reached about 40,000 Iraqis. And who were these people? Doctors, lawyers, engineers, civil servants, university professors, all the people that made Iraq run, and that we assumed would remain in their positions to run Iraq, which is why we weren't going in with a big reconstruction effort, because they would run their own country. Well, with that one piece of governance, we threw them all out of office. And with one stroke of a pen, Paul Bremer created the political basis for the insurgency. And then he disbanded the Iraqi army. Our own war plan said, we don't need a lot of security forces in the aftermath of the conflict because the Iraqi army will secure the people. And yet, he decided that we were going to get rid of the army. In his memoir, he said, well, I was just acknowledging the obvious. The soldiers had taken off their uniforms and had gone home. What he doesn't say is they took their weapons with them, and we could have called them back to the colors and reformed their units. In fact, when we realized that there were now hundreds of thousands of armed young men on the streets of Iraq, who had no jobs, we decided to give them back pay. And we said, if you want 6 months of back pay, and we'll give you 6 months forward pay, so you get a nice lump of money so You can get on with your life. They all showed up. It would have been easy enough to have a recruiting sergeant there to say, and you want a job? We need you to guard the Museum of Antiquities. But instead, we simply kicked them out of service. And with the second stroke of the pen, then Paul Bremer created the military bases for the insurgency, because many of these soldiers, at least the Sunnis, took their not inconsiderable military experience with them into the insurgency. And finally, Paul Bremer empowered sectarian politics through the Iraqi Governing Council. I won't go into the details of that, but the bottom line is we did not think through the political implications of what we were doing in Iraq. Instead, we were focusing on the military goal. I love The Far Side, Gary Larson's cartoons. This is General T-Rex with his calendar. You know, what do I do on Wednesday? Kill something and eat it. What do I do on Thursday? Kill something and eat it. You know. So this is the U.S. military's view of strategy prior to the Iraq War. I could just say this is the Israeli military's view of strategy in Gaza today, and it would be destroy Hamas, destroy Hamas, destroy Hamas, destroy Hamas, right? All was not well once that happened. We did defeat the first Ba'athist Ramadan offensive. We killed Uday and Qusay Hussein, and we captured Saddam. All good things. And that took the wind out of the sails of the insurgency for a small time, a short time, around beginning of 2004. I remember asking a prominent Sunni in my area, what happens now? And he goes, well, I think, the insurgency will wither away. And indeed it might have, had we made another outreach, political outreach to the Sunni people. But we did not. Instead, Bremer conducted business as usual and relied on the weak and highly sectarian Iraqi Governing Council to determine the way ahead. And the result was the radicalization of the insurgency as Islamic militants, or Islamist militants, let's not put the religion into it, Islamist militants gained the upper hand. We then abandoned our forward operating bases inside of Baghdad because, if there's an insurgency, it must be us, right? It's always about us. There's an insurgency because we have troops among the people, so we'll just remove the troops, and that will settle everything. Well, that hardly settled everything. And then the insurgents actually took hold of Fallujah in 2004, and in 2 battles, we ended up destroying the insurgents in Fallujah along with a third of the city in the process. And you can see this same sort of history playing out in Gaza. In Fallujah, November 2004, we depopulated the city to create what a military personnel would say a clean battlefield, not many civilians there, so you can use your firepower to destroy the enemy. We did kill 2,000 insurgents, but again, about a third of the city was destroyed in the process, and all those Fallujans had to then be resettled and then brought back into this destroyed urban area, and reconstruction had to occur. Then we decided, okay, we're not winning this thing militarily. We're not losing, but that means we're not winning as well. So democracy will fix it, right? The elections of 2005 with all those purple fingers and thumbs in the air, you might remember that the Iraqis will vote in a representative government and then everything will be okay. Except that those elections merely exacerbated Sunni fears of isolation in the new Iraq. They knew that they would be outvoted by the more numerous Shia, and therefore they would lose power. So they were not about to agree to the elections. In fact, most Sunnis in 2005 didn't vote. And that resulted in a government that was even more against their interests because it was largely Shia Kurdish in nature. This all came to a head in 2006 when al-Qaeda militants bombed the Al-Askari shrine in Samarra, the 4th most holy shrine in Shiite Islam. And this stoked the fires of sectarian hatred. The Jaish al-Mahdi, the Shiite Islamist group, which up to this point had risen up a couple times against American forces. Now it rose up against the Sunnis, and sectarian violence swept through Baghdad. By December 2006, more than 3,500 Iraqis were dying each month to ethno-sectarian violence. Bodies showing up on the streets every morning, often tortured, with hands bound behind the backs. And in this kind of environment, political reconciliation was impossible. But multinational force at the time failed to adjust its strategic approach to the conflict. That approach focused on killing and capturing insurgent and terrorist operatives, kill something and eat it, and a rapid transition of security responsibilities to Iraqi security forces. In other words, hand off the war to forces that we created on the ground and then get out. So these were the issues that we had to face in 2006. General Petraeus and I were at Fort Leavenworth at the time looking at this, not knowing that, by the way, he was going to be tagged to go back as the head of multinational force Iraq. He was rewriting U.S. counterinsurgency doctrine at the time. Sectarian violence in Baghdad was the hardest issue, but you had Al-Qaeda's main effort up here in the Mosul, Tal Afar region, which is why that ended up becoming ISIS stronghold later. Al-Qaeda was in control of the Euphrates River Valley. Iran was flowing in lethal aid. There was intra-Shia competition in the south. A lot of these same things look like elements of what's happening in Gaza. You have Iran flowing in lethal aid. You have Hezbollah launching rockets from southern Lebanon at Israel, and a huge battle for the urban spaces of Gaza. So to his credit, President Bush made the final decision to surge additional forces into Iraq. His problem with General Casey, who was commanding multinational force Iraq, and Secretary Rumsfeld, was their strategy was one of how to extricate U.S. forces from Iraq, not how to win the war. And I was in on these National Security Council meetings, kind of on the margins, but I was there. And President Bush, time and time again, says, tell me how we're going to win. I mean, he was very adamant. So it was a very courageous decision because the political winds were blowing against him. His own party even wanted him to pull out. But he agreed to basically go all in and put as many forces into Iraq as the military could dig up without mobilizing the reserves. So that was about 30 to 40,000. But these forces would be deployed differently in accordance with a new counterinsurgency doctrine. The priority shifted to protecting the Iraqi people where they lived, to insulate them from this violence that was tearing their society apart. The Iraqi forces would surge right along with U.S. forces. We added about 30 to 40,000 troops. The Iraqis grew their forces, police and military, by about 135,000 during this same time frame. There was increased support for a tribal rebellion, the so-called Arab Awakening, which had begun in 2006, but which General Petraeus decided to go all in and back this rebellion against Al-Qaeda in Iraq and create the Sons of Iraq program. Think neighborhood watch with guns. We had enough forces to pursue the enemy throughout the depth and breadth of Iraq. There were no safe havens, which had grown up over the years. We created a force strategic engagement cell. This is something keep in the back of your mind. The purpose of this cell was to make political outreach to insurgent groups to say, are you interested in laying down your arms and joining the political process? We'll give you amnesty. We'll make sure you're not pursued. And it cleaved off portions of the insurgency. And the rest, and those were the reconcilables, the rest were deemed irreconcilable, Al-Qaeda primarily, but others, and they were ones you had to focus on to kill or capture. And this was actually an outgrowth of the British deputy commander of multinational force Iraq, Sir Graham Lamb, who grabbed General Petraeus early on after a meeting and said, you know, General, you're doing this all wrong. The people you're trying to reconcile with are already your friends, right? You have to, and he talked about being in Northern Ireland and reconciling, or at least discussing, with people across the table who, you know, had blood on their hands, who had been swinging pipes at his lads in the British Army, the Sinn Féin people. And he said, those are the guys you have to talk to. So you have to talk to the people who are insurgents and get some of them to come over to your side, or at least to become neutral and agree to a political solution. And General Petraeus said, that's great, and you're going to lead the effort. Actually, it wasn't him. We did pick a British officer, though, to lead the effort. We improved techniques of population control, so barriers and biometrics to cordon off portions of Baghdad. The denouement of this was the Iraqi government that agreed in 2008, sort of on its own initiative, to attack the Shiite militias in Basra in order to regain control of that city. And this is when the Sunnis really changed their mindset, because they saw a government that was headed by a Shiite prime minister, Nouri al-Maliki, using Iraqi military forces to attack Shiite militias. And they figured, maybe the government can be a government for all Iraqis. And that's when there was a big movement politically, and you could see the levels of violence drop dramatically. By the end of the surge in July 2008, violence had dropped in Iraq by more than 90%. So this is a slide of violent incidents, and this explains up here what they are. But basically anything that goes boom or could go boom is on this slide. In January 2004, after we caught Saddam, the level was at about 250 incidents a week. And then it went up from there, and you could see during the beginning of the surge right here, it's at more like 1,450, so about a five-fold increase. Then the surge occurred. You could see the violence go sideways, and then in the summer of 2007, with the surge of offensive operations, it drops dramatically. A little bump up here when Operation Charge of the Nights, when the Iraqi government went after the Shiite militias in Basra, and then another precipitous drop, so that by the end of the surge in the summer of 2008, that level of violence was at the same level as it was after we caught Saddam. Remember back here, what we needed to do was a political outreach to the Sunnis to bring them back into the political system. It didn't happen. Here it did happen. And so in 2009 and 2010, the Sunnis, as a percentage of the Iraqi population, the Sunnis voted more in regional and national elections, more Sunnis voted than did Shiites and Kurds. So they went sort of all into the political system. So this was where the Iraq war could have been won. But unfortunately, elections have consequences. When the elections of 2010 occurred, the United States basically teamed up with Iran to back the loser. A lot of political reasons for this, but Nouri al-Maliki became the prime minister again, even though he had lost the election to Ayad Alawi by a very small number, but he had still lost. But we didn't give Alawi an opportunity to form a government. And so Maliki became the prime minister again, and he didn't want to lose power, and so he basically turned on his political enemies at that point. He refused to renegotiate the status of forces agreement, so U.S. forces departed at the end of 2011, He then proceeded to govern in a highly divisive manner, like Saddam Hussein light, again with torture chambers and so forth. And the Sunnis were once again alienated from the political system. And this led, unfortunately, to the rise of ISIS. ISIS was the successor group to Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which had metastasized in northern Iraq and Syria. It took advantage of the Syrian civil war, which created a security vacuum in Syria. So it grew up again. It renamed itself because no one likes a loser, and Al-Qaeda in Iraq was a loser. We had pretty much destroyed it during the surge. And then it invaded Iraq again in 2014 in tacit cooperation with many Sunni Arabs. The Iraqi army basically collapsed. Nouri al-Maliki had coup-proofed it by replacing a lot of the competent commanders who could potentially use force against him with his cronies. And as a result, their units weren't well trained or disciplined and simply collapsed when ISIS came across the border in this, line of pickup trucks. Even though the Iraqi army had M1 tanks, it didn't matter. As a military historian will tell you, the will to fight is as important or more as the means to fight. This forced the United States to form a coalition to destroy ISIS, which we did between 2014 and 2017. Let's talk about how you defeat a terrorist group. General David Petraeus termed his strategy against al-Qaeda in Iraq the Anaconda strategy. Now, it's sort of a Civil War term. You're going to squeeze the Confederacy and make sure that it can't get arms in or cotton out. But this was different. It wasn't just territorial. It's a holistic strategy to squeeze the life out of terrorist groups and create stability. So, what do terrorist groups need? In this case, we're talking about Al-Qaeda in Iraq and its affiliated partners. So they need foreign fighters to come in. So they need recruits, they need weapons, they need a line of communication to their senior leaders, which in this case, Osama bin Laden was in Pakistan. They need money. They've got to be able to command and control their forces. They've got ideology that they've got to get out to their people. They're trying to get popular support, and they need these safe havens in which to operate. They can't simply operate in cyberspace, as appealing as that might be. So how do you counter that? All right, so this is what military forces normally will focus on, the kinetic operations. Counter-terrorist operations, so special forces, SEAL teams, and so forth. Conventional force operations, which is what you see happening in Gaza today, what we did in Fallujah, for instance. And then the Sons of Iraq, sort of the armed neighborhood watch. If you can get locals to defend themselves, that's even better. All right, so you got that part, but there's a whole bunch of other things you need to do. So you've got a diplomatic and interagency issue here. These foreign fighters, they come from other states around the region, so you engage with those countries to try to get them to stop the flow. You fight the battle of the internet, right? Which we did. A lot of that's still classified, how we fought that, but you don't allow an uncontested battle space, and the internet is a battle space. It's an information battle space, but it's there. And then we work to seal off ports of entry into Iraq. One of the biggest conduits for foreign fighters was Damascus International Airport. We kept warning Bashar al-Assad, you don't know what you're dealing with here, because they can turn on you in a heartbeat, which they ended up doing during the Syrian civil war. You've got political things. So the awakening movement among the tribes I talked about. You work political reconciliation legislation, what you can do to counter ethno-sectarian pressures, take the steam out of the kettle. A whole sort of suite of intelligence things that you need to do here to make sure you have the best information possible. You work your detention operations to make it a net positive. So we took the detainees, we had them sing the Iraqi national anthem in the morning, we gave them job training. Most importantly, we had boards of officers look at their cases, and if there wasn't a good reason to keep them behind in prison, we released them. But we didn't just say, you're released. We released them in ceremonies with the local imam, their local governor, and other political figures and religious figures there, so that they were like welcomed back into the community. And the recidivism rate was less than 0.1%. If our prisons could only do as good a job. And then finally, you've got this non-kinetic. This is the nation building aspect, right? So you want to work the education system, religious engagement, jobs programs, and so forth. So you've got to fight terrorist groups holistically. So what is Israel doing in Gaza right now? A lot of this and a lot of this and almost nothing else. All right, so let's talk about the Israeli invasion of Gaza with 9/11 as our backdrop. As Israeli troops conclude their invasion of Gaza, the Israeli government would be well advised to remember the past 2 decades of often indecisive warfare against insurgent and terrorist groups. The invasion of Afghanistan ultimately failed because the United States did not think through the end state of the campaign as it exacted revenge for the 9/11 attacks. The Israeli invasion of Gaza will likewise lead to an indecisive quagmire if the political end state is not considered as an essential part of Israeli strategy, and it has not been to date. The goal of destroying Hamas as a military force will require both an extensive ground invasion, which is ongoing, and a lengthy occupation, which the Israelis sort of allied over when they talk about it, to root out Hamas operatives and stabilize the area. As 4 different presidential administrations discovered in Afghanistan, and as President Bush discovered in Iraq, creating stability in the aftermath of conflict is far more difficult than toppling a weak regime in the first place. Because the end of fighting will not be the end of military operations. Israeli forces will need to remain to clear out pockets of resistance. You can already see that happening in the northern part of Gaza, in Gaza City, which they had deemed clear, and now they're returning there to fight again as these pockets of insurgents rise up. And they need security to secure the returning civilians to their homes. In our counterinsurgency field manual, Field Manual 3-24, published in December 2006, we stated that to counter an insurgency, counterinsurgents should yield a security force structure of roughly 20 to 50 counterinsurgents per 1,000 population. We reached this level in Iraq, where in late 2007, we had 180,000 multinational force Iraq soldiers, mostly U.S., but some other nations as well. 340,000 Iraqi military and police, 103,000 of those armed neighborhood watch, the Sons of Iraq, and 20,000 security contractors. So that was 643,000 counterinsurgents for an Iraqi population at the time of 28 million. So that was 1 counterinsurgent for every 43 Iraqis. By comparison, we never came close to that ratio in Afghanistan, and although that is not the only reason we lost that conflict, the lack of troops certainly didn't help. Now, absent a political settlement of the conflict in Gaza, which is unlikely, with 2 million Palestinians in Gaza, the Israelis will need somewhere between 40,000 and 100,000 security personnel to control what will be a very sullen and uncooperative population. The most successful campaign against the terrorist group after 9/11 was the surge in Iraq, which General Petraeus led and which I had a small role in prosecuting. After I retired, I was invited to Tel Aviv to speak to Israeli officers on what had worked in Iraq. This was in the run-up to Cast Lead, their first incursion into Gaza, which they didn't tell us they were about to do this, but we could all kind of put two and two together. In fact, I was there, and part of that conference was Prime Minister Netanyahu, who was not yet prime minister, came into the room and gave a speech. So it's pretty interesting. Anyway, I related that the key to success would be to separate the reconcilables from the irreconcilables. And therefore, Israelis should find willing partners for peace among the Palestinians to chart a political path forward. You had to talk to people with blood on their hands and convince some of them to pursue a peaceful path. And that may be a long road, but it's the only road to a long-term settlement. The Israeli officers looked at me and said, "That's wonderful, but it won't work with the Palestinians. What else do you have for us?" They were far more interested in the tactical and technical innovations that we had done, like those barometric or biometric scanners and the barriers and so forth, than they were in the big ideas that actually led to success during the surge in Iraq. There was one other successful conflict, though, against terrorist groups in the past 2 decades. That was against the Islamic State between 2014 and 2017. That ended with Raqqa in Syria and Mosul in Iraq reduced to rubble, and thousands of men, women, and children consigned to detention camps. This is where we're heading in Gaza. Israel has the capacity to level Gaza, and has done a pretty good job so far, and round up segments of the population. They haven't necessarily done that, but they've corralled them basically into the southern portion of the Strip in the city of Rafah. To date, Israeli Defense Forces have killed in excess of 34,000 Palestinians. It's a mixture of military and civilian. By best guesstimates, about a third of those are military casualties and the other 2/3 are civilian. And 1.9 million of the 2.2 million Palestinians in Gaza are now refugees inside the enclave. Whether this is wise policy is highly debatable. Doing so may serve the immediate impulse of exacting revenge for October 7th, but Israel is receiving massive international condemnation from creating a desert in Gaza and calling it peace, to take a page out of the Roman playbook, and thus foregoing the moral high ground on which it stood after the attacks of October 7th. And from the ashes of this conflict, Hamas 2.0 is likely to emerge, as ISIS emerged from what happened in Iraq. And with that, thank you, and I'll entertain your questions. It was a very difficult issue. Initially, ironically, we were better off than we were later on. Because initially, we went to the American people and say, anyone speak Arabic? And there were all sorts of people that volunteered. In fact, my translator as brigade commander had grown up in Baghdad. So he had the local accent and everything. But he was only willing to do that for about a year. And then he went back to the United States. And then we ended up hiring a lot of locals. Well, locals have different political objectives, right? So you may say one thing and it might come out of that translator's mouth as something else because they, don't like the person you're talking to. Or, not ironically, but to their credit, a lot of soldiers who were on the streets every day picked up the language pretty quick. They developed like a 200 to 500 word vocabulary, and they could at least get along with the people they were talking to. That again worked early on. Once the war became really lethal with a lot of IEDs and terrorist attacks, there was a lot less interaction between U.S. troops and the local citizens. So yeah, I agree. It's a hard issue, one that I believe will eventually be solved by technology. Those universal translators in Star Trek? We're not too far away from that. When I run study abroad programs in Europe, focusing on World War II sites. And I just type things into Google Translate and show it to the bus driver, take us to this place, and they'll type something back. And, we haven't gotten to the speaking part yet, but that's we're not long away, not far away from that. Yeah, I don't think that would have much of an impact, because you would have the same number of people who served in Iraq. They would just be different people. So we don't have a very large military today. It is large, but it's not World War II large. So you're not going to reach a large percentage of the American people with military service, regardless of whether they're drafted or volunteers. I don't think a drafted army is under consideration, or should be, mainly because although we have shortfalls in recruiting now, we still have plenty of people who want to serve voluntarily. So the number we would need to draft to make up the shortfall is so small that the draft would seem unfair to those that actually get drafted. I'm not sure exactly how to square that circle, because we do need to fill up the ranks, but I'll leave that for the current military to figure out. I think there's a lot of anger against Israel today for the way they're going about prosecuting this war. Now, I think it goes back to their goal, right? Because when you say we're going to destroy Hamas, that means you have to go in, you have to take all of the Gaza Strip. If you want to prevent massive civilian casualties, you've got to move them out of these cities, Gaza City, Khan Yunis, and Rafah, before you attack those cities. Well, they've been moved from here to here, and now they've been moved from here to here. And you hear President Biden saying, to me, an Israeli invasion of Rafah without providing for the humanitarian needs of the people, that's a red line. Well, you got 1 million people now squeezed into this tiny community. Where do they go? I have read, I can't confirm, but I have read that Israel is actually now constructing camps, detention camps, which is, again, the same thing that I mentioned in my talk. So they're going to move the population now into these detention camps, go in, destroy Rafah, destroy the 4 remaining Hamas battalions. But Hamas has not been destroyed. Plenty of fighters still are there. Their leadership is not even in Gaza. They're in other parts of the Arab world. So I don't think Israel thought through what this would mean. Let me give you an example. In World War II, in the Pacific, I'm writing a book now on Douglas MacArthur and the liberation of the Philippines, so very aware of this example. So we wanted to liberate Manila. And we didn't think the Japanese would defend it, so we went in and attacked. But the Japanese had different ideas. So they had 20,000 personnel, which they dug in and they defended it to the last man. And we ended up attacking in February 1945 and destroying all 20,000 Japanese defenders. There were about 1 million Filipinos in Manila at the time. 100,000 of them died in 3 weeks of fighting. Some of them by Japanese atrocity, many by U.S. artillery fire. So 20,000 defenders, 1 million people, 100,000 casualties. What do you have in Gaza? 40,000 defenders, 2 million people. Right now, 34,000 casualties, but that number is going to go up when Israel attacks Rafah. Right. This is something I discussed on AC 360 on CNN on about October 10th. And I gave them that same example. I said, this is what you're looking at. It's the nature of the fighting in this urban environment. And as careful as the Israelis will try to be, it's just you're going to have a lot of civilian casualties. And you're going to pay the political price for it, which is what Israel is doing now. They could have gone about this a different way. They chose not to. And right now they're stuck because they haven't thought through how does this end? So they view this as an existential threat, right?
Yeah.
This is the greatest October 7th was the greatest loss of Jewish life since the Holocaust. It was the greatest loss of Jewish life in any Arab-Israeli war. So the Jewish people in Israel viewed this as an existential threat. Therefore, we're going to pay the political price to destroy Hamas. But even if you do that, right, now you've created the conditions for something to happen. So what should that something be? I think the American government would argue that something should be a two-state solution, right? So you get rid of Hamas, now reach out to the reconcilables, right? Which I think the Biden administration views as the Palestinian Authority, and create a Palestinian state. The Netanyahu government absolutely refuses to entertain this notion. So I do discuss it in my teaching. When I teach American military history, I talk about basically what is euphemistically referred to as a collateral damage, but non-civilian casualties. Some of them are unavoidable. I talk about the law of war, right? So the law of war doesn't say you can't cause civilian casualties. What the law of war states is the civilian casualties have to be commensurate with the military advantage gained by their deaths, right? So if you have a sniper in a building and you destroy the entire building to get rid of that one sniper, and there may be 100 people inside, that would be something that's not commensurate with destroying one person. But if there is a company of infantry inside a building and there happen to be civilians in there, destroying the building probably is within the law of war. That otherwise assaulting it with infantry in an attempt to save civilian lives probably wouldn't save the lives, for one thing, and would lead to a lot more friendly casualties. So these are the sorts of ethical judgments that military commanders have to make every day. It's the sort of ethical judgments that they teach now at the military academies. And, at least U.S. leaders are brought up having to discuss these potential losses as they go through the planning process. So I remember one actual example where I was in the Battle of Karbala in May of 2004. And there was a group of Jaish al-Mahdi militia holed up in this one building. They were using the building as a fortress. They fired on one of our companies that was in the area. And I had my Judge Advocate General, my lawyer, right next to me. And I said, we had an AC-130 gunship overhead. And we talked through, what I wanted to do in terms of targeting the building. And we talked through whether that would be ethical or whatnot. And we decided it would be, given the number of militia holed up in the building. And we ended up destroying the building and the militia along with it. And it turns out in that case, we didn't know how many civilians were in the building. Turns out there were not that many. They had vacated long ago because they saw what was happening. So that turned out to be all right. But we had that discussion right there before I called in the airstrike. There's no way to bring the casualties to zero. In an urban environment, especially, the only way to do that is to make sure the civilians clear out of the area. We were able to do that pretty much in Fallujah, basically by surrounding the city and then sending in notices saying, we're going to attack. You've got, 6 weeks to clear out. And the civilians pretty much did. But sometimes, as was the case with the Japanese in Manila, they won't let the civilians leave. They use them as human shields. So they say, you're going to die right along with us. And they did in great numbers. So it's just a very difficult, this is why you need to make sure that the goal is just and that the goal will actually lead to a better outcome. And these are the things that I think we need to debate now with what's happening in Gaza. Yeah. And I'm pretty confident the Biden administration is raising these same questions with the Netanyahu administration. And we had Senator Schumer call for elections in Israel, which, of course, the Netanyahu administration would not agree to because it would probably mean it would be voted out. Got to play with the hand we're dealt. Right now, that hand is an Israeli government that does not want a Palestinian state to come into being. My talk was not a holistic assessment of the Arab-Israeli conflict or the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. I'm trying to merely apply what happened in 9/11 to what's happening in Gaza. But you are correct. If you want to solve the issue between the Palestinians and the Israelis, you've got to take the West Bank into account. The Israeli settlements that have accelerated, the construction that has accelerated, the violence that Israeli settlers have perpetrated against the Palestinians. And with every settlement that's constructed, it makes it harder for a Palestinian state to come into being. I think this is not a feature or a bug. I think this is a feature of what the Israelis are trying to do. In other words, this is not a sidelight of putting settlements there. This is exactly the reason why the Netanyahu administration is agreeing to settlements there. They don't want a Palestinian state. Yeah, in human history, you look at Ireland, for instance, from the time the first English set foot on Ireland to colonize it, you have 400 or 500 years of fighting there until Ireland eventually gains its independence. And even then, you still have the northeast corner, which is, you have the Troubles there, as they're euphemistically called. So yes, this is something we talk about mainly in a course called The History of War. But intergenerational conflict that continues on and on and on is, that's part of human history. And what we like to talk about, though, is where that actually ends. So one of the things that I talk about in my World War II course is how Germany basically ended its emphasis on a very militaristic society after 1945, and how they now have laws. It's illegal in Germany to deny the Holocaust. They have mandatory classes in history at, I think, the high school level where Germans have to learn about the Holocaust. But now look at Japan, which never came to terms with World War II. And as a result, there is still antagonisms between Japan and Korea and China, and it's just a very different way that they dealt with their memory, their history, and their memory. This is something that's sort of new in history, is the history of memory. How are things memorialized? How do we look at this Confederate officer here hanging in the house today versus how someone in the 1920s might have looked at him? And that is something that is currently a big topic among historians. How do we memorialize and remember historical events?